There's a specific kind of silence that only exists at 70 feet above the tree line. A heavy breathing quiet that wraps around you like a cold fog. You're utterly alone, surrounded by nothing but an ocean of wilderness that stretches to every horizon. And the only thing between you and the dark is a single-pane window and a radio that crackles with static long after the sun goes down. Fire lookout towers were built to protect the forests. But the men and women who staffed them quickly learned that the real threat doesn't always come with flames. Sometimes it comes in the whisper you hear on the catwalk at 3 a.m. when there isn't a breath of wind. Sometimes it's the knocking on the glass from the outside when you're 100 feet up with no balcony. These aren't campfire tales. These are true accounts from real fire tower guards who walked into their shifts as skeptics and came down changed forever. Today we're sharing 3 absolutely chilling experiences sent to us by lookouts in the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom, stories that have never been compiled like this before. If you enjoy content that dives deep into the true horror lurking in our world's most isolated places, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss what we uncover next. Tell us in the comments, would you last a single night in a tower knowing what you're about to hear? Now, lock the door, turn up your headphones, and let's begin. Caleb McAllister had spent 3 summers as a fire lookout in Montana's Kootenai National Forest without a single incident that couldn't be explained by weather or wildlife, which is exactly why he didn't hesitate to accept a last-minute request on June 29th. To cover the old Spruce Peak Tower for a ranger who'd fallen ill, arriving at the isolated cabin on stilts just as a low-pressure system rolled in and smothered the entire mountain range in a dense, dripping fog that reduced visibility to less than 20 feet, leaving him feeling as though he were suspended inside a cloud with no world above or below. A sensation that was unnerving but manageable until the sun fully set and the real isolation pressed in. He completed his evening radio check-in with the district office, reported the 0 visibility conditions, made a cup of instant coffee, and settled into the single creaking chair by the east-facing window to watch the blackness where the forest should have been. The only sound, the occasional drip of condensation from the roof and the rhythmic tick of the wind-up clock he'd brought from his grandfather's cabin. That's when the radio, which he had deliberately turned down to a whisper so he wouldn't be startled by sudden static bursts, began to emit something that wasn't a voice and wasn't white noise but a kind of patterned breathing rustle, like a person running their fingertips gently over the speaker mesh on the other end. And when he reached to turn it off entirely, he noticed his own reflection in the window glass and something behind it, a silhouette standing perfectly still just over his left shoulder that vanished the moment he spun around, leaving him to laugh nervously at his own nerves and blame the dim lantern light for the trick of the eye. A reasonable explanation that held up for almost half an hour until the knocking began. Not from the door, not from the floor, but from the exact center of the glass pane in the west window 40 feet above the ground. A deliberate, knuckle-on glass tap. Tap. Tap that came in sets of 3 and would pause for a count of 10 before starting again, always in the same spot. Always impossibly patient. Caleb grabbed the heavy mag light and swept the beam through the fog, revealing nothing but swirling gray vapor and the skeletal outlines of pine branches. And for the first time in his life, he wished for a thunderstorm or a charging bear. Because at least those were threats he understood, threats with teeth and sound and a physical form that could be confronted. Not this insidious, escalating pressure of something just outside his perception that wanted him to know it was there without ever fully revealing itself. a realization that congealed into raw dread when the tapping suddenly shifted to the skylight above his bed and was joined by a sound that made his stomach drop, the clear, unmistakable, and very human whisper of his own name. Drawn out in 3 syllables, Caleb, spoken not with malice but with a kind of melancholy familiarity that suggested the speaker had been waiting for him specifically, had perhaps even known he would be the one in that tower on that night. And as he fumbled for his truck keys with the reckless abandon of a man who has abandoned all pretense of professionalism, the radio, which he had never managed to fully switch off, gave one final, loud, crystalline burst of static that resolved into what he would later describe to a very uncomfortable district ranger as the sound of someone humming a lullaby he hadn't heard since his grandmother died in 1998. The same melody she used to sing to him when he was a child in a house that he would later learn from old tower logs had been built on the exact site where a fire spotter named William Calhoun had walked into the fog during the 1940s and was never found, leaving behind only his hat, a half-full coffee cup, and a journal whose final entry read, in strangely neat cursive, "I am not alone, and I don't think I ever was." Jack Brennan had been fighting fires and spotting them from the high country of Victoria's Alpine National Park for the better part of a decade. A no-nonsense bloke who believed in hard work, cold beer, and the absolute certainty that 99% of so-called supernatural experiences were just dehydrated city kids letting their imaginations run wild on overnight hikes. So when he took up his annual December to February rotation in the remote Mount Bogong Tower, he did so with exactly the same pragmatic checklist he always used: extra water, a deck of cards, a well-stocked first aid kit, and a personal locator beacon he hoped he'd never need to use. The 2019 to 2020 fire season was already rewriting the history books by January, with the whole southeast of Australia baking under a dome of heat so intense that the eucalyptus forests were literally sweating flammable vapor. And Jack's tower was surrounded on 3 sides by a horizon that glowed a sick orange even at midnight, the air thick with the smell of distant burning that drifted in from blazes hundreds of kilometers away. It was during one of those brutally hot, smoke-choked nights, when the entire landscape felt like the inside of a furnace waiting to ignite, that Jack first noticed the figure standing on the bare, granite-studded ridge about a kilometer to the northwest, a dark shape that didn't move in any natural wet, didn't walk. It didn't shift its weight, it simply appeared between one scan of his binoculars and the next. An upright human silhouette, backlit by the diffuse glow of a fire that was, according to every map and report he had, burning in the opposite direction. He radioed the incident management team to report a possible lost hiker, or worse, an arsonist taking advantage of the chaos, and was told in no uncertain terms that the area he was describing had been evacuated for 3 days, and that no one, absolutely no one, should be out there. A statement that should have offered him some cold comfort, but instead made the hair on his arms stand up because, as they were speaking, he could see the figure slowly, very slowly, turning its head toward the tower as if it had heard the radio transmission. Through the 40 kilometers of mountain air that separated his lookout from the command center, for the next 6 hours, through the hottest part of the night, and into the false dawn that the smoke turned into a bloody, apocalyptic smear across the sky, Jack watched the silhouette maintain its vigil, never advancing, never retreating, never once appearing to need rest or shelter from the ash that fell like gray snow. And the longer he looked at it, the more convinced he became that it was looking directly back at him. not with binoculars or a scope, but with an unblinking, predatory patience that made him feel less like a trained observer and more like a mouse pinned under the gaze of a cat that had all the time in the world. When the sun finally clawed its way above the smoke layer and through the ridge into sharp, unforgiving relief, Jack raised his spotting scope with trembling hands and zoomed in on the exact coordinates he'd been staring at all night, fully expecting to see the figure resolve into a charred tree stump or a boulder that the heat haze had twisted into a man shape, but instead the scope revealed nothing, no person, no remains. No footprint or disturbed stone or single blade of grass bent out of place. Just bare. Sun-heated granite, exactly as featureless as it had been the day before the season started, except for one tiny detail that he almost missed. A single, fresh, human-shaped scorch mark seared into the rock face like the shadow of someone who had been standing there when a blast of heat so intense it vaporized flesh in an instant had swept across the ridge. A shadow that looked, when he photographed it with his phone and zoomed in with trembling fingers, exactly like the silhouette of a person wearing the same flat-brimmed Cuber hat he himself was wearing right then. A discovery that sent him down the 70-foot ladder so fast he left skin on the rungs, and resulted in his immediate, unexplained, and permanent transfer request that the Park Service processed without a single question. Evelyn Davies had never been a particularly fearful person, which is why she had willingly accepted a 2-week placement in the isolated Raeburns Fell Fire. Tower in the Scottish borders, a squat stone and glass structure built in the 1930s, that overlooked thousands of hectares of commercial forestry and empty, wind-scoured moorland that stretched all the way to the North Sea under a sky that, even in late June, never achieved true darkness. The tower had a reputation, whispered among the Forestry Commission's staff in the pubs of Hawke and Selkirk, but no one ever put it into specific words. Just a general sense that the Raeburns Fell posting was always the last to be filled and the first to be abandoned, then that the high turnover had less to do with the grueling climb up the exposed service track than with something people preferred not to name. Evelyn arrived on June 29th. Same day the sunset lasted until nearly 11 o'clock and bathed the whole landscape in a melancholy, golden glow that felt almost too beautiful to be real, and she spent her first evening unpacking her books, testing the aging radio equipment, and arranging the narrow cot with clean sheets, feeling an unexpected sense of peace and purpose that lasted exactly until she noticed the chair. It was a simple wooden chair with a curved back and armrests. Positioned in the southeast corner of the single circular room, facing the window that overlooked a steep drop into the clearest, darkest section of the forest below. And the problem wasn't the chair itself, which was ordinary, if a bit worn, but the fact that every single time Evelyn left the room to use the chemical toilet in the small antechamber or to step onto the external catwalk for air, she would return to find the chair had moved, not dramatically, just a few centimeters to the left or a few degrees turned toward the door, as if someone had been sitting in it during her brief absence and had risen the moment they heard her approaching. She conducted the logical experiments. She weighed the chair with her bag of flour to rule out subtle vibrations from the wind. She marked its position on the floorboards with a piece of chalk. She even filmed a time-lapse video with her phone that, when she reviewed it with increasing horror, showed the chair remaining perfectly still for the full 45 minutes of the recording, except for a single frame at the 17-minute mark, when, for exactly 1/30th of a second, the empty chair was not empty at all, but was occupied by a figure that the low resolution rendered as little more than a dark, human-shaped density, head tilted as though reading the very book that sat open on Evelyn's nightstand. That night she woke to the creaking of wood directly above her head, not the settling of old beams. Not the wind, but the rhythmic, repetitive sound of a person rocking slowly back and forth on an old chair. A sound that stopped the instant she flicked on her torch and resumed the moment the light clicked off. A pattern that repeated until she was forced to accept that whatever was making the sound was responding to the light. Aware of her awareness, playing a game whose rules she didn't understand, but whose stakes she was beginning to sense were much higher than a mere fright. She pulled the old tower logbook from the shelf, something she should have done the moment she arrived, and paged through years of mundane weather observations until she reached the 1950s and found a 3-month span of entries written in a different hand, a shaky, tight script that started as professional firewatch notations and slowly devolved into disjointed, increasingly desperate messages about a visitor who appeared only in the corner of the eye, who spoke only in the creak of furniture, who had, the final entry claimed, walked out the door one foggy morning without opening it. Evelyn finished her 2 weeks because she was stubborn, and because some part of her refused to let a haunted chair be the thing that broke her. But she never again sat with her back to the southeast corner of a room, and when she submitted her end-of-placement report, she included a single, handwritten recommendation on a separate sheet of paper that the chair be burned. Recommendation the Forestry Commission, to their quiet and unspoken credit, followed without objection the very next day. And those were 3 true Fire Tower Guard horror stories that prove the wilderness holds secrets far darker than we imagine. If these accounts sent a chill down your spine, you're not alone. Every single one of these lookouts walked away with a terror they still carry years later. And sharing their experiences is how we honor the courage it took to speak up. We rely on viewers like you to keep finding and telling these real-life nightmares. So if you found yourself holding your breath tonight, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm to spread these true tales to others who need a good scare. And drop a comment telling us which of the 3 stories would keep you up at night if you were trapped in that tower. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps our late-night research sessions going, and we read every single one. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the next time you see a fire tower on a distant ridge, someone might be in there, and something might be watching them from the tree line.